we all have power. And as Catherine reminds us, your stories are powerful, and you being here is powerful enough. But there are many things that we need to keep in mind as we go through our advocacy journey in food and agriculture. And to get started, I want Gloria to tell us, who are you?
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you all for the invitation. Before we start, can we just give a round of applause for the individuals who have been giving us food and drinks this afternoon? Muchas gracias. Maybe I'll say a few words in Spanish and then I'll do English. So, gracias por la bienvenida. Yo soy Gloria Montaño Greene, subsecretaria de un departamento de agricultura. Aquí muy humilde estar aquí con ustedes. Mis raíces son, pues soy de rancho, como se dice. Y cuando me preguntaron de servir en esta parte de administración, yo pregunté, dime con quién andas y diré quién eres. Y por qué escoger una persona como yo, que de padres que no se graduaron de la high school, apenas se graduaron del tercer grado, del 8 grado. Uno se vino de inmigrante, otro fronteriza, pero dijeron siempre que hay que seguir adelante, hay que buscar educación y hay que trabajar por la comunidad. Y decir que me preguntaron de ser parte de este sistema, para cambiar el sistema, para mejorar el sistema, para mejorar el gobierno. Tuve que decir que sí, aunque es difícil a veces. Y mi historia no está solamente en agricultura, sino para encontrar cómo buscar poder o que la comunidad sea parte de los sistemas que les afectan. Muchos dicen, yo no soy político, yo no soy de la política. Y les digo, pues caminas, usas carro, tomas leche, comes, te pones ropa, todo es hecho de política y tenemos que ser parte de esas decisiones y tener nuestro poder. Pero el poder es diferente. Soy pocha, hablo los dos idiomas, pero gracias para ustedes que han venido y que han participado no solo en este grupo, pero venirse a Washington, D.C. y saber cómo trabajar agricultura. So my name is Gloria Montaño Greene. I'm the Deputy Undersecretary of Farm Production and Conservation. What that means in your guys' day-to-day lives. That's the Farm Service Agency, the Natural Resource Conservation Services, Risk Management Agency, which does federal crop insurance, and then an administrative arm that's the business center. There are over 20,000 people across the country and territories of the United States in over 2,100 offices to be able to think about and focus exclusively on agriculture, ag financing, conservation, disaster, land access, risk management tools, you name it, we get to think about agriculture. And how did I get here? So I'm an appointee of the Biden-Harris administration. I just am 2 years and 1 week in. And I have devoted my last 20 years, or some, although I know I look very young. Thankfully for the lights, you can't see my canas, or highlights as my dad calls them. To be able to think of and work on how does government engage the community it's supposed to serve. And I have done that in various policy issues, on the Hill, in federal advocacy, in state advocacy, and now at the federal government within the Department of Agriculture. I said earlier that soy del rancho. That's a very easy saying for Latinos usually. But I was raised in this rural part of Arizona that's not on any map of the not on most maps, 1 out of every 5 maps. And I am a first generation of many things, a first generation American, a first generation high school graduate, and a first generation college graduate, and definitely a first generation to serve for a president. And I've gotten the honor to serve twice, once under the Obama and currently under the Biden. But with that responsibility comes a lot of engagement and what is your responsibility and why do you choose to do difficult roles. The same way of why do you all choose to be members of the Young Farmers Coalition versus I'm just going to farm, so let me farm. The reality is policies impact you day to day. I've dedicated my life to be able to figure out policies and how to engage people to participate. A lot of the conversation that I've done on the advocacy space is people say, I'm not political, I don't do policy, like it's not really me. And my response is really like, do you drive a car? Do you walk on a sidewalk or a street? Do you have, I'm from the rural community, right? We did not have paved roads, and when my parents got a paved road, they had a concern with that. Right? What do you drink? What do you eat? How does it consume? Like, all of it has policy implications, and the more that we don't participate in some of those decision-making processes, it's not a win or lose situation, it's a participation process and how we engage there. So I've come here not necessarily in like a deep agriculture, but more in like diversity of agriculture, but have been working on some version of agriculture policy when I was on my Hill days, and completely, 12-hour days on agriculture work now.
Definitely. Well, we're excited to have you. Gloria, I know a lot about your background, but I would love for you to tell me maybe one formative experience. It could have been 20 years ago, it could have been yesterday. Something that you said like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, or I'm doing the right thing.
Well, I guess maybe where my path changed to become a policymaker, or to become participating in policy. I was failing in college, took some classes, decided I was a first generation, I couldn't afford to drop out of college because that was the path of movement. So I took general education requirements and ended up doing Mexican American studies to be able, and I had an aha moment, right? Of like, oh, Arizona used to be part of Mexico, and then like, there was this thing called Trio de Guadalupe Hidalgo, and my family's been here for generations. I belong, right? And so I was like, I'm gonna do history, and I'm gonna change the stories and understand, and I'm gonna understand the way how history and the stories of who's are told need to be part of like how we learn from them, right? And I was gonna write the history stories of that people had gone. So I interviewed people that participated in the 60s movement to fight for land access, actually, green space, for a community that felt that they needed to have parks for their neighborhood and not a golf course in the 60s. And I interviewed people. So one of those individuals was an individual guy named Raul Grijalva, who was not a member of Congress. And 2 years later, he ran for Congress. I volunteered for him. And then he won, and I was like, cool, I'm gonna finish my work and go be a historian and write these books. You can guess what has happened. But so he talked to me, knowing some of the teachers that I'd had and some of the mentors that I'd had about understanding not just the importance of history, but how history does influence or how we have to learn participation. And that's, the participation, I think of like John Lewis all the time, right? Like, he is definitely an individual that I ground myself in. Justice is something that we have to continuously work on. And what I have understood and learned has evolved and will always evolve. It's a forever work in a good way. But anyways, the congressman had just won. He was not sworn in, and he approaches me and he's like, why don't you come work for me? And I was like, I don't think I'm gonna work for government. I'm gonna go do this other stuff. And he's like, well, why are you going to do that work? And I was like, because you want to make sure community voices and voices that aren't usually included are heard. And he's like, well, if you want to do that, the best place to do it is the government and in the inside. Because government has to help people. Government doesn't say no, right? It's not how much money, it's not like, if you don't have money for the contract that says no, like they're supposed to help. So if you want to help, you have to change government. And so starts in 20 years later here, still I am doing various government change. And so the work, has been to understand and appreciate the awe of the system, but not be intimidated by it, that you don't make it improvement for work. And I always think about like the opening of our Constitution, right, is, in order to form a more perfect union. And in order to actually live that, we have to keep working towards what does that more perfect look like. Because we have to strive for it to always change and improve.
Wow, I always knew you were Leslie No. Today I confirm it. Leslie No from Parks and Recreation.
Sorry, I need that's on a eventual to watch.
It's okay, you're embedding it. I think we can just go put cameras inside USDA, it will look just the same. So before we had talked, you have mentioned that a lot of your work is democratic agriculture. A lot of what we usually refer to as civic agriculture, or like using agriculture as a vehicle for us to engage civically. And especially for many of us, I think that's true. And for me as an immigrant, I know that's how I found belonging in the United States. It was not through volunteering or doing arts, it was through engaging in food and agriculture as a form to insert belonging and democracy. So can you tell me, how does that look like to you? How do you define it? And what can we learn from it as we try to utilize that as something we can drive from to energize us?
Yeah, so I think it's come a long time for me to actually like embrace that conversation, right? Because I think when we talk about democracy or civic engagement or access, we really only think about it in a voting space, and it's that and so much more. It's in representation. It's in making sure people understand your expertise to inform decision making, and it's to make sure, right, like decisions sometimes are made by the people that show up. And the less we show up, the less the decisions are there. But it's hard to show up sometimes when we're stretched at capacity, or like even taking this call and this request, right, to serve. It's like, what do I do with my family and my kids? And like, I can't, I mean, like, you know, I didn't tell my mom for a month that I got the job offer, because I was like, how am I going to tell her I'm going to be spending all my time in DC and not in Arizona anymore, right? And so, I'm like, you know, like,
Relatable. Too relatable.
right? So I think that's one of the hard parts is like you have to make sure it's like, how are you pushing forward on it? So maybe I'll just use an example of some past work I've done. The most immediate job before this, I did Latino community organizing on energy policy and public lands policy, and democracy rights on its own. One of the biggest parts is like, how do you explain your utility bill to someone versus like, I just pay it? And how do you connect that the light that goes on and off in your house actually has a bunch of policy decisions of implications, be it on your personal economic, on climate, on community investments and jobs, right? And so how do you break that down? Because we're all just stretched, right? And we're all just moving, and how do you understand, like, you paying something, you doing something has that impact of it. So it's how do you break it down, and then also realize when you do a call out, you're not gonna get a room of 100 people, 150 people. That sometimes that change has to start with gathering 3 people. And energizing those 3 people to get 6 people more, and energizing those people to maybe get 10 people more, and then you lose 6 people, and then you gotta bring them back. Or you gotta find new people, right? Or you like people that are really good about posting, but not good about working, right? And I'm not saying that in a bad way, because sometimes you need the posters more, right? So it's like understanding, like, what are the strengths and movements that you have to be able to connect. So I think it is like, you guys are in agriculture, specifically, and food. And there's a lot of conversations, right? There's the foodies of the world and like wanting to make sure that I'm going to all these other things, that I have to like get the new restaurant and stand in line and other items. And then they think that they're doing food to farm or farm to table, right? And then there's like those that like to be part of their CSA, those that like to do their food market, and then there's like a disconnect of what is actual ag policy and what is it, and it's more than gardening, and like the decisions and the understanding of inputs and the economies that you're putting in forward, and access and items. So in some ways it's like, how do you bridge the food consumption and desire culture with ag policy? And sometimes there's a nexus and sometimes there's not. So it's like, maybe like the civic work is like, how am I, ni de aquí ni de allá in everything, right? Mm-hmm. Not just in culture of who I am as an immigrant, but like in some ways it's how do you bridge the world? I'm from rural Arizona. I went to school in Tucson, Arizona, which is a city, and I showed up, and they're like, Latinos aren't from the country. And I was like, oh my gosh, we are. Like, we really are. Like, you should have seen my school. Like, you really should have believed I'm not the only one, right? And so, like, how do we connect that loss in translation? Because we have experiences to be able to engage, but it requires me listening to you of where your gap is, and then realizing I have a gap, and then you know, like, so it's like that. How do you bridge that, and how do you break it down in normal terminology? Because you guys can talk about soil health and, like, your nutrient management and your et cetera, and, like, will that work with someone that just wants to buy really cool tomatoes and support you? I don't know, right? So how do you bridge that as, like, I guess, like a constant puzzle that it's, like, in my head?
Definitely. And I think we are always trying to bring our authentic selves to this space. And on that note, I want to
Which is why I was late earlier.
So I want to read you this quote. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Frederick Douglass. And I think about many of the identities on this room, my own identities, the identities that we share. And I think about all the things that we are told that we cannot be or that we cannot do. For example, women should be quiet. You are too young. You don't know what you're talking about. O my favorita, calladita te ves más bonita. Silent, you look prettier. For not the bilinguals here. How do you fight all those prescriptive barriers, all those assumptions, and how do you walk past them and say, here I come, this is what I'm going to do?
That's a hard question, because I don't think you ever fully bury those, and you're kind of always grasping at it and pushing it. And I'm just actually going to push it back on you, if I could.
Okay, take notes, everyone.
Well, it was you, and I think it was Sophie at the time, and maybe Martin, right? I had just started 2 weeks in. Let's have a conversation with the Young Farmers Coalition. And I reminded us, like, hey, you know, there's all these other positions. Are you guys talking about state executive directors, state county committees, county committees? And I can't remember who said, there was like, oh, we're not old enough to do that. And I was like, are you capable? Like, if you don't want it, that's fine. But these are positions of decision making or to be able to help move, right? So it's kind of like a constant muscle that we have to force ourselves to do, right? It's like, or things that we have to test ourselves to do, right? I hated Brussels sprouts, never touched them in my life, and then in my 30s, I started eating them, and I probably eat them every 3 weeks, right now, like, right? So, like, it's like one of those, what is those muscles that we have to turn ourselves on? I think it's one, when you go into a room when you might be the only, or you might be given a different expectation or title, is to remember, I have knowledge, I have a reason to be here, I would like to have a support, but even if I don't, my support is me. And sometimes I'm not really good about saying, so I put it out in the universe so I can see if I ever listen to it myself as advice. I was definitely raised, though, for the very stereotypical structural family, right, of like gender dynamics, but my mother always also pushed back on things of like, il novio, ya te vas a casar, right? Like, so it was like, my mom's like, oh no, like, that's like something for them to do much later on. And so she kind of, without knowing, pushed us to do things. But then when she pushed us to do these things, she didn't actually understand what they were, right? So I went to college. And she's like, but there's one, like, you know, driving. And I was like, yeah, but I'm going to go to a college because I wanted to, like, not live at home. But I didn't tell her that. Right? And then you get there, and I was like, hey, there's this thing called a master's. And they're like, oh, just graduate and go to job. Like, that's... right, because they're investing, and like sometimes we're pushing boundaries that the people that are around us don't know where to support. And I think that's kind of the things, you guys are in a group of people that like, how do you support each other? And I've found that on like, how do you engage in policy, and when it's new and it's beginning, but it's like kind of something you have to kind of remind yourself, like, I don't know this experience, but I gotta keep pushing on for somehow. And I think about it, right? Because like I do ag policy, but I kind of left DC 10 years ago to leave federal policy work, right? And was going to do regular state work and that reminder of like, well, what are the strengths that I bring to the table to be able to stretch it and move it to the limit? And so we kind of have to do that. And sometimes it's actually like those quotes actually help you remember, right? Power is not going to be given, which means power is not given because perception of power is that somebody's losing power versus you adjusting and distributing power might actually just strengthen the entire system. And so we kind of have to put that back on its own word.
And I'm gonna have a selfish moment here. I remember that meeting because I am the most unapologetic first person in Young Farmers Thing, I think. And that's the reason I became one of your policy directors, because one of my love mottos is I had the confidence of mediocre white men. And I remember in that meeting, Gloria saying that, and I feeling like Gloria gave me permission to do something that I felt I was not qualified for. So even me, like a badass person, I felt like I needed permission to do that. And then I applied to be Rhode Island State Director. I didn't get it, but I learned a ton of shit going through that process. And because I didn't get that, I got a state committee, and now I serve on Rhode Island State Committee. So, yeah.
And you guys gave a slate of candidates, and you worked with your senators to get some positions.
Exactly. And so all of you want to run for state committee, you come find me. But it's also, it's that little thing. Sometimes we need to have that verbal permission that we are allowed, that we can do these things. So all of you have permission, so go do amazing things.
I mean, if I can add to that, right? I think like there are various access of governments and items that we have to be thinking about. So kind of maybe going to your first question, or earlier question, civic agriculture. There are various places to consider your engagement, right? There is the county committee process for a farm service agency. There is the state committee, which is appointed by the secretary, right? There's the state executive director that is appointed by the president, regardless what administration exists, right? These are the roles within FSA. And in NRCS, it's making sure that you're like the conservation districts, right? So these are then how the federal government has like localized engagement and movement, and that participation is there. And then urban ag county committees is something that's really new to be able to think about what is that role for education, engagement, and knowledge that you have. And so it's making sure, yeah, there are different ways to access and engage on policy.
Definitely. And now we're going to talk about more about policy change, because that's what we all are here for, right? We came to change policy. So, Gloria, you are now Deputy Undersecretary of PAC. You were in LCV. You were State Director of FSA. You were in the Hill. You have seen policy in so many different positions. What works and what doesn't work? Policy staff, please take notes.
So I think it's understanding who has what parts of the role. I am a Farm Bill implementer, right? I work on the executive branch. I implement policy. So the legislative branch creates policy. The legislative branch might ask the executive branch for technical assistance to be able to understand. So it's like understanding those items. And I say that because I am not drafting, and we are not drafting a farm bill. But we will be called, there have been hearings the last few months, multiple hearings, I can't remember how many, right? And has been able to see how members of Congress are asking us for engagement. The other part is kind of like showing up, right? Showing up is a big part of participation. And then showing up and knowing what is your ability and why are you there and what are you engaging on. When I was on the advocacy end of it, I talked about earlier, I did electricity work. And we went into a meeting that usually only has lobbyists and lawyers. And I showed up with 12 people. Because remember I said we have to think about our numbers and growth. And I showed up with 12 people all in red shirts that did not look like anybody that had ever attended that meeting before. And then the following meeting, I showed up by myself, and the security guards told me, you make more of an impact when you show up with the people in the red t-shirts. Right? Because the voice is real, authentic, and you can't. And it's the reminder of like that you have a voice in the process. And it's also kind of like, making sure that what you come to say is what you come to say. And that there's decision-making power not just in DC, but also in your state or your districts or like your city or your engagement on things. And there is a huge role that we have for federal. And for us, right, like the engagement you guys have done is like you have made sure that there's reports that Young Farmers Coalition shares and that you push those reports out, and then you guys remind us all the time of like, these are still gaps, and these are things that we think you can rewrite the rules, that you have the legal authority to do it, and like you guys are constantly reminding us or engaging with us on it, or you're writing it in opinions and pieces to us through public comments, the conversation like you guys had earlier this afternoon, some of you, to be able to think about, we know, everybody knows programs always have to update. There are certain things in agriculture that haven't changed, but there are other things in agriculture that are changing, right? And that we have more 2-acre farms, 5-acre farms, 10-acre farms. The age of farmers are changing. There's all these things, and so how are we understanding if there's barriers in our program for removal? So like reminding us of those barriers, and if you have examples of it, right, can you adjust it? I'll just think about like farm storage facility loans. I don't know if you guys use those. It was raised to us while we had, under the Obama years, expanded the farm storage facility loan. There was like something that just came up locally in one of the county offices, right? That somebody said, I would really like your farm storage facility loan to do this. They applied for it, got denied, and like we've been working, and so we finally interpreted like where we had that legal capacity to cover bushel bins, certain bushel bins, right? Like so, like before, refrigerated food trucks weren't part of farm storage facility loan. That just took people asking and saying, this is a need, is there any way, or is like the law written very strictly? So I think it's showing up, asking the questions. But like not ask, in some ways, like it's okay to be theoretical, it's okay to be conscious, it's okay to move us. But like sometimes there are a lot of barriers that is not just the federal, not just the individual, not just the county, not just the city or nonprofit. So it's kind of like how can we engage and be collectively working on things together?
Definitely. And I think together is the right word. So in a selfish plot moment, what are we doing right?
Oh.
You mentioned the op-eds, you mentioned our reports, but if you want to say something more, please go ahead. We will take it.
So I would say like you guys are regularly engaging, right? Because you want policy to be created with, the buzzword is customer experience design, but really it's understanding what is this impact of a person and how does this impact of a person. I think trusting us enough to come and talk to us is a...
You want me to come on more often?
Right, but I mean, like, it is one of those things, right? Like, right, but it is to be able to understand, right? Like, and that knowing that I don't have a magic wand as much as, so I think that's it. I mean, like, there's been some policy engagement and conversations, and also as programs has rolled up, right? Like, we can break it down, but how you guys have broken it down even further. We had a lot of the pandemic assistance for producers work that we did, and what we rewrote, how a lot of that COVID help was happening to be able to say, how can we actually reach in a little bit deeper? You guys participated in some of those conversations to be able to see like, what are the gaps, what's missing, who didn't get covered, right? And so whenever some of those questions are being asked, and I know it comes to you, but I mean like, from your shop, but like the reality is it comes from response that you get from the country. Because like I can have 150 conversations individually, but then like that could be my entire work, right? And that's not that I'm against it, because I'd actually probably appreciate that. But like it's also like funneling, because like what happened is like, and what came up is you guys had themes that showed up across the states, but there was uniquity based on your region. And so those are conversations that you guys did bring to us. The increasing land access, we just finished out the funding opportunity that we posted in August or September. It closed in December. it's a funding opportunity, right? It's not a program enrollment, so it's understanding that differentiation. You guys helped make sure people knew that that was a difference. But in some ways, like, we read your guys' report. Some of the funding opportunities, there's a firewall of how we prepare and move them, but like, you guys laid out questions, laid out possible solutions, also laid out partners. There was other partners that talked about land access, and like what parts are federal, what parts are counties, what parts are cities. So when we did that funding opportunity, we weren't prescriptive. We really kind of said, here's the problem. Here's an area, do you have any solutions to address? And then I think, I just feel like, the non-insured assistance program, like one of the big things is like agriculture is a huge risk. We all know that, right? And risk management tools need to happen explicitly for small producers and beginning producers, and they're really hard. So we just recently made some changes to NAP, right? And it's actually understanding what is the risks that are happening, how can we help with that risk? And I think there's just always, conversations that help influence, are we doing it right? Because if we're trying to make improvements, doing it in a silo without understanding what is the barrier that we need to remove is going to be very hard to remove barriers.
Yeah, thank you, definitely. And I would love for you to tell us more about what are some of those changes in policy that you're working on, that you have administrative authority to, that are affecting young farmers, like NAP, for example.
Yeah, so NAP is one. In the crop insurance space for RMA, they have just specifically rolled out a micro producer policy to be able to think about the size of the producer and can we leverage whole farm. The other is the pandemic assistance program and the emergency relief. I think that's something to look at because most program enrollments have been land-based and how many acres you have. So the two programs we just rolled out, the Pandemic Assistance Revenue Program and the Emergency Relief Program, Phase 2, is to actually revenue-based to be able to think about it. We've also been doing taxpayer education because it's not a program, but what we realize in having a lot of these questions, right, is taxpayer providers sometimes don't know how to help farmers, right? And it's not a 1040 easy, that would be really beneficial, or 1040, right? So how the, I just, 1099, the 1099, wait. Schedule F, thank
Schedule
you.
F.
Thanks, I'm like, gee, that's not the one, I was talking about something else. Right, sorry. Right, and so we've been providing a lot of robust classes like that are for producers themselves and for taxpayers on like not providing we're not providing tax advice, but more education. So it's kind of like know your rights. Like know your rights on what you are is like how taxes affect you, because there are some benefits and some ways to be able to leverage that information in other spaces. So, I think the conversation is how do we streamline the farm loan has been an item, right? Like it's like hard, it's robust. We just moved it down from 29 pages to 13 pages, right? Yeah, for the farm loan. So right, like, I think that was like a hard thing, right? Because it's not something splashy, but like who just said what? Like because that's a game changer for what it means for you to apply, but also for the staff person to be able to. Like it's a two-way road that needs to happen there, and so I think it just. And a loan assistance tool that we released to better actually navigate it versus saying, here's just a fact sheet. The loan assistance tool helps you ask questions so you can actually better have an understanding of what loans you should be considering based on your situation, right? So I think those are our items. Ag financing, I think you guys talked to the administrator today. I'm pretty sure he talked very detailed about it. And the administrator spent his entire life trying to improve ag financing from the outside, and now he's doing it on the inside. So I think there's a lot of robust engagement. That, sometimes daily changes that we make aren't highly visible, but they impact the change of improving the system.
Definitely, and we thank you for your hard work on making all of that and leading a lot of that effort. It's trickling down. We will see the changes slowly and surely, but definitely we know that this will not happen over your lifetime, my lifetime, I don't know. We know that every farm bill is an opportunity to bring the young farmer lens forward, to talk about the barriers. Do you have any suggestions? How do we continue doing so?
Well, for Farm Bill, right, when Congress passes one, we will be having to implement that. And so there are still 2018 Farm Bill items that are being implemented. Some of them are designed, some of them are still to be designed. And so that requires various ways of how to get done, right? So I think it's like the understanding your role of engaging on that. And so there will be rules that'll have to get written, understanding like, is there streamlining? So like for us, like the constant ask and for my team is, what can we streamline? What are the, you know, versus everybody complains about, you name the program. I'm just gonna tell you. You name the program, everybody complains about something about the program. So it's like, can we actually figure out like what parts that we can bite while we also think about larger changes we need to be thinking about, right? So so that's to come like the farm loan application. Can we streamline it a little bit while we're also doing other things about agriculture financing? So I would just say that like, you know, Farm Bill is forever work.
It's always Farm Bill season.
It's always Farm Bill season. You know, and like right now we are implementing a lot of programs. We already implemented the bipartisan infrastructure law work under NRCS. We are implementing under the Inflation Reduction Act, also like the farm loan work, but we're also implementing in the NRCS bias of the House, right? Increase of EQIP, increase of Regional Conservation Partnership Program, easement work, et cetera. So I think that's something to consider and like to be able to have your eye on. For the West, for those on my Western states, right, drought is a huge, yeah, I'm from Arizona. I think I said that earlier, but I actually like live in Arizona half of the time and live in DC half the time. Right, water, I mean, water is life for everyone, but like water has been very much like really scary, right, intense. And so like the Western Water Strategic Framework that NRCS released, yes, it's an internal tool, but it's an internal tool to help your state conservationists, your NRCS state folks make decisions on prioritization and investments and thinking about leveraging Inflation Reduction Act. That required input from producers, input from groups, et cetera, to be able to move forward. And then now that also includes input at the local level with your state conservationists, with your state technical committee, with your conservation districts, et cetera. So there's a lot moving on it. I think you guys actually participated in various feedback for the Inflation Reduction Act in the comments. So like the comments that sometimes there's like comments are so difficult to write, but they do help inform decision making moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. And we don't make any of our farmers write comments. If you want to, let me know. I will happily teach you. But usually we ask to always talk to your organizers. Usually we ask our organizers to go ask you those questions so the DC team can submit those comments to people like Gloria. So always answer your organizer phone call or text message. Please, always, yes. Well, we're wrapping up, and I just wanted to ask you any last words of advice, anything you want to say to your younger self or to Vanessa 2 years ago when she started this job?
You're supposed to be in the room.
Yes. Well, I think that's the most important thing. Yeah.
I mean, I would just say, right, like, you know, when I started and I told you guys, I got convinced to work for a congressman, and I got to do casework, which is the coolest job in the world, right? Except certain hard conversations are always hard because you had to be the bearer of you had to deliver bad news, and the only thing you had to do was like just work with federal agencies to get an answer. So now on the receiving end of this casework, I'm like, oh, sometimes I apologize to my agencies, like, I'm sorry, I was on the other end one time. But then when I moved to DC, right, it is a very amazing, very central, and just remembering like that power here requires local knowledge to move. And so that's why it is truly like, right, you belong to be in the room, and just being grounded, and like your experience does help shape it. Sometimes it's hard to see it, but people that hear your stories, it sticks with them and it shares with them. And if any of you actually when the secretary has speeches, or if you're ever invited to them or online, I highly recommend, right, because if he's had a touch point or engagement, he will remember that, and it does actually stick up quite a bit. And questions that he asks us are, well, what are you doing? Because I just had a conversation with this farmer and this small rotation, this small group, and like, so those stories are very important to understand, like, why it's important for you to be in the room.
And I just want to recap how important is, your stories are so important. I cannot say that enough. Like, I have a job because you're here. So I have people from USDA call me that they met a farmer 5 years ago and now they want them to testify in Congress. So those interactions matter, you telling your stories to everyone that you meet, and also telling people the things that matter to you. So, for example, something that everyone is supposed to do with their caseworkers and congressional office that never do and pisses me off, every time you apply for a federal grant, you need to let your members of Congress know. So, let that be FSA, let that be a local grant, let that be anything else. Because they need to know what federal programs and resources you are utilizing. So that's just a general good practice, because they're supposed to be working for us, working for you as their constituents. So tomorrow when you're telling their stories, it's their job to listen to them and act upon them. So now I want to open the floor to take at least 3 questions that you have. You can always ask for career advice to Gloria. She keeps me straight. And I just want to give Gloria a round of applause before we take those questions.